From the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, I'm Stewart Patrick, and this is The World Unpacked. Russia's war in Ukraine has prompted a serious rethink of security in Europe. A NATO alliance that French President Emmanuel Macron declared brain dead back in 2019 has roared back to life, with Western nations sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. However, there's been one item on Volodymyr Zelensky's wish list that he's had trouble getting his hands on in recent weeks. That's tanks. Both Germany and the United States have been reluctant to send tanks to the front lines until just this week. Meanwhile, Germany has a new defense minister in Boris Pistorius, who will play a key role in shaping the future of Germany's policy and the evolving military and defense capabilities of the European Union. Joining me today on The World Unpacked for her very first time is my colleague Sophia Besch. Sophia is a fellow in the Europe program at Carnegie. Her research focuses on European defense policy. Until recently, she was a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform in London and Berlin, but she's since come across the pond and is with me here in the studio in Washington, D.C. Sophia, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you at Carnegie and to have you be able to rely on your expertise today. So I want to dive right in. Last week, Christine Lambrecht resigned as Germany's defense minister. Chancellor Olaf Scholz quickly appointed Boris Pistorius to replace her. It was a surprising move for a lot of people because he's got a background really in domestic politics. Who is Boris Pistorius, and why do you think he was chosen?
That's right. It was a surprising move, and it's an excellent question. So Boris Pistorius is established and experienced SPD politician, a social democrat. He was the interior minister in Lower Saxony, and he's now our defense minister. I think he was chosen. You said Olaf Scholz chose him quickly. It actually took a couple days. And I think that's because the defense minister post is known as a little bit of an ejection seat in German politics, right? It's not necessarily something that'll further your career. Lots of people have struggled to remain in office. I think he's chosen him because he trusts him, because this is a really difficult time for German defense policy. We're undergoing a sea change, a Zeitenwende, a change in times. And because he trusts Boris Pistorius to work closely with the Chancellery. What Olaf Scholz needs now is close allies in this important post.
Well, Pistorius is certainly being thrown into the deep end. Among other things, he's had to deal with mounting pressure to send Ukraine its powerful Leopard 2 main battle tanks. And just today, Germany announced that it would send Ukraine 14 of these tanks and would permit its partners, including Poland, to send their own stockpiles of Leopards to Ukraine as well.
Das ist das Ergebnis intensiver Beratung erneut mit unseren Verbündeten und internationalen.
The United States, for its part, is expected to announce that it'll dispatch its own contingent of M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. I want to dig deeper into all of this. First of all, how big of a deal is it that Ukraine has finally gotten their hands on these tanks?
It is a big deal. It's something that the Ukrainians have asked for, I think, since week one of the war. It's going to help them. These battle tanks are hopefully going to help them to defend against a Russian offensive that we're expecting in the spring. It might also help them to gain back some territory from the Russians. I think we have to be careful, though. This is not a silver bullet. It's not a silver tank. It's not magically going to change the tide of the war, but it's certainly going to help the Ukrainian armed forces.
And is this something that's going to happen really quickly, or is this going to take some time? I know that the M1 situation, at least for the United States, there's a lot of worry that this was going to be, these were not going to be sustainable, or that they require so much maintenance, and they're really kind of an extraordinary military instrument. You're relying on jet fuel or its equivalent, from what I gather. Is this going to happen within the next few weeks?
Right. So it is probably going to take some time. It's going to take less time for the Leopard tanks because they are already in Europe. We're hoping that maybe by March they'll get them to Ukraine. The Abrams tanks is probably going to take longer. I've seen different estimates, and that is precisely because of the points that you mentioned. It's because of the logistics. It's because of the fueling. It's because of the supply parts and what goes into repairing these tanks. I mean, it's not just a question of dropping these tanks in the middle of the battlefield. They have to come with all the logistics that is necessary to sustain and maintain them. Let's
talk a little bit more about the context of this sort of drawn-out, protracted German decision regarding the tanks. Obviously, as we've discussed, Germany was one of the maiden holdouts here. What's the reasoning behind Germany's reluctance? Is this a legacy of German history in part, or has there been some other diplomatic calculus at play that's been influencing this decision-making process in Berlin?
So this is a really interesting question, and people have discussed this at length. What might be the reasoning behind Chancellor Scholz's reluctance to send these tanks quicker? One of the reasons that we've discussed this so much is that our chancellor is reluctant to communicate and explain himself. But what we can gather, I think, is that there was a real fear of nuclear escalation, that there was a fear that sending heavy battle tanks to Ukraine would be used by Russia as a pretext for escalation. And this is why I think this is how we need to understand Chancellor Scholz's reasoning of not wanting to go it alone, of wanting to closely coordinate with partners, and particularly the United States, to be able to share that risk of escalation.
Right. So there's a sense that this could be a provocative act that would, in a sense, cross a Russian red line, was at least part of the calculation.
Absolutely. I think that's it.
So I want to place this in the broader context of the potential transformation of Germany's defense and military posture and profile, including on the European continent. Last year, right when the war began, Chancellor Scholz made a speech that many dubbed a turning point in German foreign and defense policy, and it was, as you said, the Zeitenwende. What is Zeitenwende, and is this move to send tanks to Ukraine indicative of this new vision?
Okay, I'm going to try to be brief in my answer, but I could talk about this for a long time. So Chancellor Scholz, in his speech, which was dubbed the Zeitenwende speech, Zeitenwende translated is just a turning of the times. So he was describing a turning of the times. He was basically saying the world is changing, so our policy needs to change too. And he announced in that speech a couple of concrete measures. So he announced defense spending increases, 100 billion euro extra fund of defense money on top of our regular budget. He announced that we would send arms to Ukraine, which was a bit of a moral taboo in the German debates. Sending arms to a conflict area was something that many were not comfortable with. And he announced a change in our energy policy. So we were heavily dependent on Russian energy imports. About half of our gas and a third of our oil came from Russia. Over the last year, we've become completely independent from Russia.
That's a remarkable transformation.
Absolutely. It's remarkable. And it's come with many difficult decisions. You know, we have a Green party in power at the moment. They would have liked to do this completely on renewable energies. They were not able to do that. We've had to rely on coal and buying energy from other questionable sources. But, you know, we have done it. We are now independent from Russia. So if you look at just these announcements and what has, in a sense, been achieved, you could say that, you know, Zeitenwende is real and it's worked. But if you read the news and if you speak to people about Germany right now, it's not an unequivocal success, right? And I think there's lots of reasons for why Germany is criticized. Partly it's resentment on the part of our Central and Eastern European allies who are saying, of course, that the world didn't change in February 2022. The world has been like this for a while. Mm-hmm. We've warned you for a while, and you've been ignoring our warnings even after 2014, the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. Partly it's substance, right? So there's some questions over how much money are you actually going to spend? How sustainable is this defense budget increase? Which weapons are you actually sending? And then there's criticism of communication, I think, and just in terms of how clearly the Chancellery is communicating. And the tank issue is a good symbolic example of this. I mean, in the end, you know, Germany is one of the largest contributors of aid, including military aid, to Ukraine, the second largest European contributor. We are sending these tanks. The question is how much China has been broken on in the way, right? How difficult of a diplomatic process was this? How much does it seem like Olaf Scholz needs to always be pushed rather than take the initiative?
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. Even a week ago, Defense Minister Pistorius said that many allies shared Germany's stance on the tank issue. But if anything, it sounded like Europeans were resolutely pushing Germany for a more assertive position against Russia and to really come forward with this. In the broader context, do you see waning confidence in Berlin's leadership role in Europe? Or do you think that the tank issue will help now that it's beginning to be resolved, will help restore confidence in Germany generally?
So the question of German leadership is a difficult one. And actually, it's something that Germans are often asking. What does that actually mean? What do you expect from us when you ask leadership from us? I wasn't in the room when countries were speaking out about battle tanks. I'm sure that Europe was divided on this question. Some countries volunteered, said that they would like to act in a European consortium. Others, like France, were similarly quiet on the issue. We still don't know if they're going to send their Leclercs, right? So these fears of escalation are absolutely shared by other European countries. The question of Germany is always in the hot coals. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, sure. Or in the hot seat, perhaps, yes.
Yeah, Germany is always in the hot seat on the question of leadership, because what allies are often expecting, including the United States, is for Germany to take the first step, right? Germany is the biggest country, biggest economy, largest population in Europe. And yet on security and defense policy, historically, very reluctant to do that. We talk of a reluctant hegemon. We talk of an economic giant and a military dwarf. That's something that's played out on this tank issue as well.
More broadly, in the context of Ukraine, do you see cracks in European solidarity developing, particularly as the war drags on and there's the question of what is the eventual end game of the European Union or of the broader Western alliance with respect to Ukraine? Are you seeing some cracks in European solidarity and staying power? And is this emblematic of that, or have you been surprised by the degree of actually coherence and unity on the part of the EU?
So I'd like to give a pithy answer to this. It's not always as easy. I think in general, I've been very impressed by the solidarity and unity, both in Europe and in the transatlantic relationship.
And I stand here with the conviction that with the necessary courage and with the necessary solidarity, Putin will fail and Ukraine and Europe will prevail.
I think there were a couple of moments that we were really worried in the beginning of last year. We were worried that the energy crisis, that a difficult winter might really undermine solidarity. And that's not happened, right? Countries still stand behind Ukraine. You could argue that President Putin is doing its utmost to keep solidarity up, right? Whenever there's some doubts whether he's really as bad as we think, he proves that he really is. But there is, of course, and you talk about this difficult question of end states. Of course, there are different threat perceptions. There are different interests in Europe as well, depending on very simply how close you are to Russia, right? And so this is a conversation that we're not yet having publicly. And I think we're right to not yet publicly talk about end states just because it would be divisive. But behind the scenes, I'm sure these conversations are going on.
Well, when we come back, I'll ask Sophia about the future of EU and NATO defense strategy. Hey, thanks for listening to this show. If you want a great podcast on U.S. foreign policy, you need to check out our premier live podcast, Carnegie Connects. My colleague, Aaron David Miller, talks to some of the biggest names in U.S. foreign policy, from secretaries of state to top White House officials and leading reporters on the ground. Go and check out Carnegie Connects wherever you get your podcasts. Now, let's get back to the show. So, Sophia, we've almost reached the one-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How has the war shaken up the thinking of EU countries when it comes to their collective defense?
It's shaken up everything. We've talked about a German Zeitenwende. I think we can talk about a European Zeitenwende, right? There's really a new understanding, a shared threat perception. And we see this reflected first and foremost in the defense budgets. All European, all EU member states are increasing their defense spending, which is huge after decades of underinvestment, right?
And in Germany, that they're been an agreement now to reach the target of 2%, right?
Yes, the famed 2%. So actually, I mean, there's a couple of questions over this still. We have sort of put an additional pot of money on top of our regular defense spending, which has never reached 2%. With this additional pot of money, we're probably going to get there next year for 2 years. And then we don't know what will happen after that because this pot of money is limited to 5 years. We still haven't had a commitment to increase our regular budget to 2% after that. One of the things that I think Berlin is rightly being criticized for.
But you're seeing this also in other European countries, you were saying, and also at the sort of more federal level in Brussels. Is that correct? This new spirit of sort of collective defense in Europe.
That's right. I think we've seen, I mean, you've mentioned Emmanuel Macron's comment about the brain dead NATO. Clearly, NATO has proven itself as the backbone of European transatlantic security organization. You know, it's really countries are reinvesting. Even countries that have maybe in the past been skeptical, like France, is, to its credit, heavily reinvesting in NATO and in NATO's deterrence. There's also been efforts in the EU to respond to this Euro defense moment, particularly when it comes to defense industrial policy. I mean, the EU, we have to remember, was built as a political, economic alliance, not necessarily a military alliance. But what it does really well is integrating markets. And of course, right now, there is this question of we have this defense spending bonanza. Everyone's going on a shopping spree. It would be great if we could coordinate procurement a little bit to ensure interoperability in the future, countries being able to train and fight next to each other on the same equipment. And that's what the EU is trying to do.
Yeah, you wrote a great article back in December about how the EU can better coordinate defense spending across its member states, as well as not be so reliant on NATO. And your article talked about a few mechanisms the EU has in its regulatory arsenal to incentivize that sort of cooperation. Well, what are some of these mechanisms that you would point to?
Right. So this is quite EU nerdy, but I'm glad that we talk about it.
Well, that's right. We needed a nerd.
Wonderful.
You also are speaking plain
happy.
language and can walk us through.
No one ever asked me about this, so this is great. So the EU has a couple of different ways that it can try to do this. In the past, it's tried through market regulation. What it is trying now is basically financial incentives. So it's really hard to cooperate on defense procurement and defense development. It's often more expensive in the first place to get lots of countries to work together rather than buy from a third country supplier. So what the EU is trying to do is to give a financial incentive and make it logistically easier for countries to cooperate. The question is, will countries pick up on this, right? So far, what we've seen is not that. So far, what we've seen is countries falling back on national domestic interest, buying from all over the world, buying different systems. And that's partly because the EU doesn't necessarily have the budget yet to offer a real financial incentive that might change countries' thinking.
Can I ask why this focus on, in a sense, defense spending through the EU? I mean, after all, most EU member states are members of NATO. In a sense, why this need for, in a sense, a separate EU defense strategy?
Right. So I think there are things that NATO can do that the EU can't do, and there's things on the opposite that the EU can add that NATO can't necessarily do. NATO is still an intergovernmental structure. It's largely an operational military alliance. It is reliant very much on disciplining these countries to act, and often it's the United States that disciplines countries to act within NATO. The European Commission does have actual legislative power, right? It can pass regulation that countries have to implement, and it has a budget that it can access to incentivize countries acting together. So in the defense industrial space, there's real potential for the EU to act. Though we have to say that so far, all these initiatives mostly exist on paper, right? I think there's potential here, but so far we've not really seen the EU take the initiative and countries buying into the EU taking the initiative.
So when you think about European integration, you think, of course, about France and Germany. They've historically been the motor of European integration. The EU's two largest economies. They field the biggest militaries in the bloc. And they have, since World War II, been the driving force behind developments, ever since, the coal and steel community, in a sense, in 1950, 1951. But you write that they don't always see eye to eye. How would you describe the nature of these visions in Paris and in Berlin, and the nature of the partnership? It's often depended quite a bit also, of course, on personalities,
Right.
And who actually occupies the president of France's position, and also the chancellorship in Germany.
That's absolutely right. I think part of the strength of this partnership is that they don't see eye to eye. I mean, one of the reasons that they're a motor for European integration is that once Berlin and Paris have agreed on a compromise, usually the others will follow suit, right? So it's part of the strength there. Of course, then it depends on how close the relationships are. And you're right, that is often down to character. Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz are not very alike. Emmanuel Macron likes to explain himself a lot. Scholz prefers to stay quite taciturn. But I think they're both aware of the importance of this relationship, and they are certainly working on lots of different issues very closely together. What is interesting right now is that we are seeing at least a conversation about whether in the context of this war, this partnership is really the most relevant, and whether we're not seeing more leadership from Northern and Central Eastern and Baltic European states. And while I do think that just structurally, as you say, for all the demographic reasons, France and Germany are going to continue to be relevant, they certainly have to make a bigger effort, I think, to reach out to those other countries to try and include them in their reasoning. And then, I mean, we can have a conversation about different strategic visions if we want to talk about European strategic autonomy, for example, which has long been.
I want to get to that in a little bit, but I want to throw a curveball here, which is the curveball that we were all thrown, which is Brexit, and really how this Franco-German relationship relates to the UK's now independent relationship in NATO, of course, but outside of the EU itself. Have you seen ramifications from the fact that the UK is no longer in the EU? Or when it comes to these defense conversations, is it still a very close partner?
Right. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. I lived in the UK. I lived through Brexit.
And somehow survived.
And actually took a lot away from that. But I worked a lot at the time on these questions of how were we going to cooperate with the UK on defense and security issues after Brexit. And I think after some initial questions over what a global Britain would mean, what that would mean for the role of the UK in the world, over the course of the last year in this war, the UK has really focused on European security. It has contributed a lot to this war, worked closely with the partners in the region. I think is really appreciated also by Central and Eastern Northern European countries in the context of this war. It's also managed to work through really complex coordination issues like on sanctions. The UK and EU have always been aligned, as has the United States. So I think on security and defense, in a way, this was always going to be the easiest question. There are other issues, of course, on the economic side that are much more difficult to work out after Brexit. Security and defense, because it's largely intergovernmental, was always going to be easier. But in terms of the diplomatic relationship, that's a different story right now. So, I mean, both the relationship between France and the UK and between Germany and the UK has certainly suffered over Brexit. And I think this triangle of France, UK, and Germany, we've maybe seen a bit of a low point over the last couple of years with Brexit, with AUKUS, all of these questions. And now there's a realization on the part of all three capitals that they need to reinvest.
Right. And by AUKUS, you're referring to the UK, Australia, and U.S. Sort of a partnership that was part of that was had to do with submarines being sold to Australia, sort of replacing a deal that the French had made and creating a lot of diplomatic fallout as a result of that. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the American role in all of this. The war has obviously highlighted the continued pivotal role that the United States plays in European security, as well as the importance of robust military capabilities in Europe. Multiple U.S. administrations, of course, most notably the Trump administration, have called for greater burden sharing between NATO's American and European pillars. What more can the U.S. do to nurture or encourage a more militarily capable Europe?
Well, the question, I think, is really up to the U.S. to do so, right? I mean, we have seen, as you say, the U.S. take a real leadership role militarily, but also politically in organizing the European response to this war. And while that is fantastic, and it was the only way, Europeans by their own would not have been ready to do so.
And what sort of things did the U.S. do in that regard that would you find, in putting together the coalition, at least initially, and sort of stiffening spines?
Right. Well, I think stiffening spines is the right way of thinking about it. I think it was a lot about reassuring. It was a lot about reassuring Western European countries that the U.S. was there, reassuring Central and Eastern European countries that they wouldn't have to just rely on Western European countries, right? Because it is, at this point, still a question of capabilities and of nuclear deterrence. And for both of those, Europe still relies heavily on the United States. Of course, we've had a conversation in Europe for years over questions of European strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, right? A Europe that is more able to take responsibility for its own security and defense. Those questions remain really relevant. The U.S. has been involved in this war, but we know that the long-term trend is steering Washington in a different direction to different regions of the world, but also maybe just to pull back their engagement globally a little bit in general. I think once we're out of the heat of this war, we're going to have to really rethink we're going to have to really rethink how we organize our own European defense. And I mean, just coming back to something we said earlier, I think we're seeing a bit of a feel-good spending bonanza right now, with the risk of not actually reorganizing and restructuring the problems at the heart of European defense industrial cooperation. And I'm worried that 5 years from now we'll be where we were when we started.
Yeah, this is really an interesting tension in U.S. and European attitudes. Obviously, the United States has been pushing for greater burden sharing for a long time. But of course, the assumption has always been, at least in my perspective, that any European defense capability should, of course, be devoted to and consistent with and not duplicative of NATO. And I guess the question for you is, has the Ukraine war increased the desire to, in a sense, create these capabilities to align with and be assisting NATO's overall mission? Or is there an aspiration growing for, as you said, strategic autonomy, where these new capabilities actually are trying to create an integrated EU defense capability that can be used independently, frankly, of Washington? Because there's always been this tension, as I said, in U.S. European debates over transatlantic burden sharing within NATO is, yes, develop these capabilities, but please only use them under the authority of a supreme allied commander based in Brussels. Tell me if I'm right or wrong in that, and how you think this is going to develop.
Yeah, you're certainly right that this has been a perception for a long time. So if you ask Europeans about this, what you'll often hear, particularly in Brussels and Paris, is, well, the U.S. is asking us to do more, and then when we try to do more, they tell us to stop, right? Right. So there is, I think we've had a pretty abstract conversation on autonomy and what that would mean for arms sales and defense industrial interests. That conversation is now a lot more concrete, right? Right now, the threat perception is clearly to Europe's east. It's clearly Russia. And that means, in a way, that there isn't a problem right now. In a way, right now, everyone wants to develop weapons and equipment that will support NATO, and the EU does want to do the same too. The questions, of course, are more in the future, right? What about Europe's southern neighborhood? What about China? What about areas where the European and the U.S. interest might diverge or might not necessarily be prioritized in the same way? This is when we'll face these questions again in the future. But right now, there's great unity over where the threat lies.
If you spoke about the future, if you look out to 2033, which is amazing to think that's only 10 years from now.
Yes.
but do you anticipate greater pushing on the part of Europeans for sort of a more coherent, independent defense apparatus and structure that is, globally deployed, under, in a sense, authority of some European supreme allied commander? Or do you see a continued real reliance on the United States for its defense? I guess what I'm asking is, does the transatlantic alliance, do you think, look the same? Could you envision a European as secure in NATO, or two rather independent pillars, which is actually, frankly, at the beginning of the Cold War, George Kennan said there should be, it was like a barbell concept, that there should be two independent, freely standing pillars, precisely to avoid the kind of dependence that we've seen over the decades.
That's right. This is my favorite part of the job as think tanker, is that you can just wildly speculate and no one's going to hold you to account.
Right, exactly.
But no, I do think that we're likely to see a continuing transformation of the burden sharing and of Euro-Atlantic security, because I think that these trends that we were talking about are going to continue to exist, right? And that in a way, the current war is not a determinator of the future. It's more an example of what the Euro-Atlantic alliance was built for initially, but it's not necessarily where we are going to be on these questions in the future. I think all these different examples of how we could rearrange burden sharing that you named are possible and are imaginable. I think, to me, what would make the most sense if I was in charge and could build this is to have NATO to continue to focus on deterrence and on operational cooperation, and have the EU work more on defense industrial and defense market questions, but build out a stronger European pillar within NATO that doesn't rely quite as heavily on U.S. leadership in the alliance. That's
fascinating. And the article that you wrote really does point to, let's not get caught up in overly abstract debates about European strategic autonomy. Let's focus on practical things. And I think I commend that article to everybody, because it's really wonderful. Before we stop, I'd really like to get your sense of what you think European perceptions are of U.S. domestic political developments. And in this case, I'm particularly interested in, the fact that the Republicans have a very narrow majority, but of course they've got a majority in the House now. And does that raise, again, the sort of reservations about how, could we see in a couple of years a swing towards, again, either Mr. Trump again or a like-minded successor in the White House, and that might call into question some of these some of these longstanding commitments that the United States has had to its European allies. Is that in the back of folks' minds in Europe as they look at the situation?
Of course, yeah. No one is ever able to forget that. It's in the back of everyone's mind in Europe. In a way, acutely with this war, we've had to kind of focus on this hot crisis going on right now, and we've had to rely really heavily on the U.S. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard Europeans say with a sigh of relief, thank God that it's President Biden in the White House right now. We don't know how this war would have gone had there been another president in the White House, right? So they're very aware of how perilous the situation is. And I think the Trump presidency in particular has set in motion thinking about how Europe could prepare for another presidency like this and how Europe could prepare for the future. I don't think we have the answers yet, but there's certainly concern. And right before the midterms, when it looked like it might be an even more extreme outcome, and that Europeans might not be able to rely on Congress as much as they have in the past, there was a real moment of fear, even just with this war. Would we be able to rely on continued U.S. support packages for Ukraine, right? So I think the wake-up call has happened, and Europeans aren't able to forget about this.
Right. So, as in many parts of the world, the unpredictability of the United States can lead countries, even very close allies, to think about hedging their bets in different ways, whether that's self-reliance or looking elsewhere for diplomatic support. That's absolutely fascinating. Well, we've come to the end of our show. Sophia, thanks so much for being a super guest.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's really been great to walk through some of these complexities, both of Germany's role and the future of European defense. And this is obviously a moving target. So we are going to be knocking on your door again to
ask
you to walk us through all of these complexities in the months and years ahead.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked, brought to you by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And please don't forget to rate and subscribe. The World Unpacked is produced by Cliff Jayapranata and Clarissa Guerrero and edited by our audio engineer, Tim Martin. Catch you next time.